Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help them be successful. I'm your host, Steve Berg. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Lytical Ventures. Season 4 is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Also, please find Intangibles on the web at www.intangiblespodcast.com. As I began the Intangibles podcast a year and a half ago, I had just finished reading Grit, The Power of Persuasion and Perseverance by Angela Duckworth. At that time, the book was one of the most talked about in the venture capital industry, and it certainly hasn't lost much luster since then. Angela Duckworth was in high demand as a speaker. With no track record as a podcaster, I emailed Angela and invited her to talk with me. Predictably, she politely declined, as I'm sure most people would have. When I got to season 2, Angela was heads down doing research, but remained as gracious as ever. By season 3, I was starting to become a pest. However, as season 4 began, the stars aligned, and one of the 5 people that made up my wish list on the guest page for my Intangibles notebook, Dr. Angela Duckworth, agreed to come on and is our guest for this episode. And so I'm very excited to tell you that the topic today is the power of nagging. Just kidding. The topic today is grit. In case you don't know who Angela Duckworth is, here are a couple resume line items to make your jaw drop. She's the founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance the science and practice of character development. In 2013, she became a MacArthur Fellow, which means she won what some call the Genius Award. This is a sizable, no-strings-attached grant to do research. Not to mention, it's typically given to geniuses. She has advised the White House, the World Bank, teams in the NBA and the NFL, and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Her TED Talk is among the most viewed of all time, and she is the Christopher H. Browne Distinguished Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she received her Ph.D. The list goes on, but you get the picture. For brevity's sake, we're going to dispense with some of the normal formalities. Instead, we're going to jump straight into the interview. So let's begin. Hello, Dr. Duckworth. I'm so pleased to speak with you today.
Hi, Steve. I'm glad to be with you.
Excellent. I'm going to jump right in and just get right down to business. Your definition of grit, which is in the title of the book, is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. It's a pretty compact definition. Would you unpack it just a little bit?
I do think of grit as having an and in the middle, and that and is between passion and perseverance. In other words, it's not just perseverance. It's not just work ethic and resilience, which I think of as really how perseverance plays out in the lives of the high achievers that I study, but also passion, but also being in love with what you do for a long time. And the passion that I find to be most, admirable and predictive of high achievement is sustained passion. So not being like, oh, I want to do this and pull an all-nighter, and then, I come back to you in a week and you've moved on to another interest or goal. But when I come back to you a week later, a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, you are still in some way, shape, or form working on the same long-term project. It's that kind of passion that married with perseverance is what I call grit.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to dig into that more. I was thinking about this as I was researching, all the TED Talks and all the things that you've written on it. And I'd like to propose to you kind of an alternate definition of grit and see what you think. I'd like to define grit as the rate of change in one's exertion relative to the rate of change of the challenge posed in the achievement of a long-term goal, right? So basically, I think as it gets harder, you try harder, but up to the limit, the relationship only holds up until the limit of when you basically hit your optimal efficiency curve, which is your ability. What do you think about that definition?
Wow, that is like super advanced black belt. Yeah, I'm just catching up with you. So you're saying that like when things get really hard, people who are gritty like rise to the occasion, and that's how you think of grit. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, a challenge isn't going to be kind of monotone, right? Over time, it's going to be easier some days and harder some days. And it's harder today. Am I bringing more game to the game today?
I see. Okay, well, let me just, go along in the way that you've been thinking about it. I mean, I will tell you that when I interview people who are exceptionally gritty, they absolutely are people who like, oh, and today's 3 times as hard. Like, all right, I'm bringing it, right? But maybe one thing that's just as admirable about these people is that when things are going really well and they're winning, for lack of a better word, they tend to like increase the challenge themselves. There are a lot of coaches who worry just as much as when their players are winning in a streak than when they're losing many games in a row, because they worry about what's going to happen to the motivation and the drive of the winning streak player. And I love competitors who are able to kind of up the ante themselves, even when nobody else is asking for that.
Kind of manufacture their own challenge.
Exactly. I mean, relentless challenge seeking is something I've noticed about really gritty people.
And what about this bit that I threw in at the tail end about the optimal efficiency curve, which basically is you can only do that up until your ability, and then all of a sudden that relationship doesn't hold anymore?
Well, I think that in a way, there's this educator and activist I really admire named Jeff Canada, and he says that he's not an athlete per se, but he's an activist who's working in Harlem, and he said you have to treat yourself like a performance athlete, and by that I think he means that you have to play this as a long game. So when you're training to the point where you're not getting return and you're starting to injure yourself, you should stop and you should rest and take a day off, etc. So I don't know if that's what you mean, but I do believe that you should practice only when there's a return on that practice. This is why I think one of the most misunderstood things about practice, many times people say like, oh, 10,000 hours, like just brute force quantity of effort. And the key to that research on how experts practice is that they actually practice differently than other people.
Yeah.
And what sets them apart is the quality of their practice as much as the quantity.
Perfect. So you completely entreed into the next question, which is one of the building blocks, effort, right? And as far as I can understand it, there's 2 parts to effort, which I personally think of as either work or exertion in the way I kind of make a formula out of it. So there's consistency of effort, and then there's what you were just talking about, which is quality of effort, and that's directed practice, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Deliberate practice.
Deliberate practice. So explain, I love the back and forth that you had about improving your running. Maybe you could explain about what deliberate practice is in context of a story, or just explain it kind of broadly for people.
Yeah, for a long time, and I will say that this is maybe more when I was a younger woman, I was running every day. So that I had, total consistency. I mean, I ran, I would run the same route in my neighborhood, and I would, leave the house, and I could set the clock by the time I came back, because it was always the same amount of time, but there was remarkable consistency. But I wasn't doing deliberate practice. And the reason I wasn't doing deliberate practice, and I discovered this by talking to the guru of deliberate practice, Anders Ericsson, who informed me that I wasn't doing deliberate practice. When I described to him leaving the house at the same time every day and coming back at the exact same time, and I was complaining to him, really whining that I wasn't getting any better, and so how could practice be such a great thing, because I'm no faster than I ever was, despite my many miles of running practice. He started asking me questions about, whether I had a goal. Like when I left the house, did I have a specific aspect of my run that I was working on? My pace, my form, the way I moved my arms, my breathing, my time, how I was going to take the hills. Like literally, I had no goals. I just left the house and, put on my earbuds and came back in. He was like, okay, you have no goals. And then he would ask me about feedback, about whether I was getting any feedback on, any of these things that a runner would possibly care about, pacing, form, et cetera. No, I didn't get any feedback either. course I didn't. I didn't have any goals. Why would I need any feedback? And then finally, I think he would ask me, a little bit about, over the years, I got to work with Anders Ericsson, this scientist, very intimately, about focus and attention and about whether I was really focused on what I was doing or, in fact, as I was describing to him, like listening to podcasts and music. And when he discovered that I had no goals, no feedback, and that my attention was divided, he said I couldn't have been doing deliberate practice. And that may be the reason why I was seeing zero improvement. So consistency, going up for a run 5, 6, 7 days a week is one thing, but deliberate practice is about quality of practice. And you really need both if you want to be, in this case, a better runner. And I told him I didn't want to be a better runner and I didn't care. And he said, fine. You don't have to care about running, but you shouldn't expect to improve in your running unless you're doing the kind of practice that leads to improvement.
That's that story inspired me. My son is 9. He's a soccer player. And he's like, Dad, we're chipping today. And I was like, okay, great. And we just were out doing whatever, kicking around, right? And I realized that we were not, like he was intending to improve, but we were not doing deliberate practice. So I got a box and I said, all right, we're going to chip as many times as it takes and we're going to count until you get it into the box with your right foot. And it took him 34 times. And then I was like, all right, great. Now let's do the left foot. And 34, 50, 60. He's like, Dad, I can't. I'm like, you know how Ronaldo learned how to do this? He's like, no. He's like, by doing this. He's like, 107 times. 107 times he got into the box. And now he thinks about practice in that way. He's like, Dad, let's go get the box. So it's a bit, I mean, that's a really big, I thought it was important. And when I heard that you tell that story, immediately I put it into practice.
It's brilliant, right? I mean, it's not my idea. That's why I can say it's brilliant. I mean, and it is actually, I think the difference between this kind of like mindless going through the motions. I mean, think about all the kids in America right now playing piano, like setting the alarm for like 30 minutes of practice, but without an intention, without a very specific goal, like like this is what success looks like. This is why I'm practicing. It's wasted time.
Yeah. It's a shame, actually, considering that there's a desire. All right. So let's move on to perseverance, right? That's another building block. That seems different from both effort and tenacity to me. I mean, I think of perseverance as kind of consistency of effort. When things get harder, when the odds of success get longer, that's perseverance. Do you think of it any different? How do you see it?
Yeah, no, I think you're pointing out that, going to practice every day and trying to do high quality practice and to do it consistently is one thing, but maybe you could also use the word resilience, resilience in the face of setbacks or adversity. I mean, that feels to you maybe different. And if that's the distinction you mean, then I completely agree. I think there is a psychology of getting up again when you fall. And there's a lot of neuroscience on that too. And it's very related to what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset and what Marty Seligman might call like optimism. Because what enables someone to get up when they fall down and to rise to the next challenge is a belief that you can change and grow. And Marty might say that this is like an optimistic way of explaining what happened to you. You're looking for causes of what happens to you, that you have some control over and that you can change so that the next time things go better.
That is, I mean, those are the underpinnings of everything. I mean, I would say of all the people that have been on the podcast, if they didn't mention either Carol Dweck, Martin Seligman, or Daniel Kahneman, I'd drop over dead. And these, they literally are the kind of triumvirate of the basis of how people think about this. So I'm inclined to believe. Okay, let's spend a moment on passion. You were talking about passion kind of right off the top. Certainly part of great. Passion is a little bit of a difficult word for me to get my head around if you really want to know the truth. I feel like it's a little overused, maybe a little underdefined. Maybe I think you were using enthusiasm. I like enthusiasm a little bit better. What are your thoughts on passion as it relates to grit and more specifically how you measure it?
I have been wondering about why there are so few synonyms for the word passion, because when you talk to people who really love what they do, I mean, it comes out of their mouth, right? I mean, they'll call their work a passion. I mean, maybe they'll say it's like a calling, but that's little more rare. And I kind of share your sort of like, I mean, it feels like a Hallmark card, right? Like,
Yeah.
really, people like, but I think the idea is, it is romantic, right? I mean, it is like having a devotion. I think it's not a coincidence that this word passion, which we would also use for, falling in love with someone or being in love with someone, is the word that kind of just drops out of the mouths of these people. So to get to what it is, like to just basically understand what this word means, I think people who feel that their work is both purposeful and fun are the ones who will tell me that it's a passion. At purposeful almost always means being part of something that is larger than yourself. It's not just the people who are community organizers and doctors who feel this. It's even individual athletes. I mean, people who play an individual sport and therefore are kind of playing for themselves. Even they feel like, they're winning for their team. They're winning for their other team in terms of like the U.S. or their coach, fellow athletes in the same endeavor. So purpose, in whatever form it comes for you, but feeling part of and in service to something larger than yourself. And oh my gosh, this is fun. This is interesting to me. It's enjoyable. When you put those things together, I think you'll be the kind of person who, if I sat next to you on an airplane and I asked you, do you love what you do? If you have both purpose and a sense of intrinsic interest or enjoyment, you'll say yes.
So I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like the word comes out of people's mouth two different ways. Sometimes when it comes out of their mouth, you can kind of feel the energy and you're like, yes, this person actually genuinely has like a love. Sometimes people are like, oh, I'm passionate about ballet dancing. And you're just like, not so much. You can always tell who means it and who doesn't, at least in my experience.
I think that, like, for me, it is a lot about the reaction time. How long does it take you to answer the question?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if there's a long pause and, your eyes kind of go up to the right, and you're like looking at the ceiling,
Yeah.
you're like, yeah, and your voice goes up half an
Yeah.
octave. I do wonder.
Yeah.
And I think, by the way, it's not something that, you have to think of as fixed. I mean, I think for me, if you asked me in my 20s, I'd probably start crying. I mean, I didn't have a passion. It really bothered me a lot. It really bothered me a lot. And I did cry a lot about it. And it took me until I was 32 to figure out that I wanted to become a psychologist. So I have a lot of empathy for people who have not yet developed a passion.
That's very polite. So the attorney David Boyce, who's argued high-profile cases like U.S. versus Microsoft, Bush v. Gore, he was severely dyslexic. He didn't actually learn to read until the third grade. And the thing is, he learned to compensate by memorization and to use his strong memory to critically analyze the material he received on his cases. And he's actually quoted as saying, I think my dyslexia has helped me in a number of ways. To begin with, he said, the fact that I had difficulty reading notes, I had to learn to speak without notes. And I learned to figure out what the key points were, to organize my thoughts clearly and comprehensible. I personally have never heard dyslexia spoken about as an advantage, but my question is, does being presented a challenge to rise up to, is that a thing that will spark your grit?
It's so funny. My fortune cookie today, and I, went to this Chinese restaurant, cracked open the fortune cookie, and I just like laughed out loud, said, because I took a picture of it, every adversity carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And, to think about dyslexia, which we wouldn't wish upon any child, right? Because it's a very heavy burden to carry. The idea that it might teach you powerful life lessons or might force you to learn, certain life lessons. I've heard that as well from dyslexics like Toby Cosgrove. John Irving attributes a lot of his strength of character in his writing. He's obviously a great novelist, but he himself was severely dyslexic, which resulted in him not doing very well in school, including his English class. So this idea that Nietzsche expressed as what doesn't kill me makes me stronger is in fact something that I think runs through the paragons of grit that I've studied, which is that they do confront adversity with a mindset of, what can I benefit from in this experience. It's not a naivety. I mean, it's not that these people don't recognize that adversity is a burden, but they are looking for the upside. They're looking for the silver lining in every cloud.
All right. I'm going to move. I know I'm going fast, but I'm just like, there's so many things I want to ask about. I'm going to move on to talent. Also, I kind of find talent a little vague also. And the reason why is because every discipline has a different definition of talent, right? And possibly a different way to measure it. Like, for example, what qualifies as talent for an athlete or an academic or an artist, they may be completely different, right? And it's tough to have a single conversation about those three particular types of talent.
Well, talking to you, I feel like I've met my soulmate. I have all the same questions that you do. And, so many people are actually unlike you and me, and they're like very happy to use the word talent without ever defining it and stopping to ask what do I really mean by this magical word? I even have a graduate student. He's actually a former NFL quarterback who is now getting his Ph.D. in psychology. He started graduate school even later than me. He's past 32. He's already got 2 kids, and people have asked him, what the heck are you doing going to graduate school? Most of his friends, I think, are athletes, and he wants to study talent, and he wants to study how people use this word. And in his experience as a former professional athlete, sometimes this word talent, coaches will use it just to mean how skilled you are, right? And then other times they use it to maybe refer more to your potential and to whether you have the X factor. So I agree with you that there is a lot of confusion about what this word means, or at least that people are using it differently. And sometimes even the same person, I think, can be using it differently in different contexts. Yeah. But one problem, there's a piano teacher named Cindy Lamb who I interviewed, and she said, I call it the T word. She doesn't want to use it because for her young students who are, 5, 6, 7 years old, when they start thinking about talent, they do think of it as kind of you have it or you don't. And oh my God, what if everyone thinks I have it and I don't? So I think it has a lot of baggage with it. This word that we use in different ways has a kind of implication of giftedness and innateness, and something you can't change. You either got it and you were lucky, or you didn't get it and you were unlucky. Yeah. I like to talk about skill or mastery more than talent, because it doesn't have as much of that baggage.
So, all right. So we'll get to skill, but we need to, you're actually pretty good about this. You have a really tidy way of bringing the disparate definitions of talent together. You say talent is the rate at which one increases in skill with effort, right? That's pretty clean. That goes across all the disciplines.
That's my definition. And yeah. I was trying to, like you, I was trying to be cleaner, right? I was like, let's get to some precision here. And I think when I define talent this way, then I can say, okay, now I can say how it's different from skill, right? Talent is how quickly you improve in your skill when you try, when you put in effort. Skill is actually how well you do something.
Right. Okay. So, all right, let me think about that. So if skill equals talent times effort, then that just means, all right, how good you've become at something like swimming or spelling or whatever. Then achievement is skill times effort. Hold on, do I have that right? Okay, so that would be that would be like setting the world record in freestyle or winning the Scripps spelling bee or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, so let's use Will Smith, my favorite example, because he's my favorite human being. I'm a total fangirl.
He's a Philly, right? He's a Philly guy, just like you.
A Philly kid, and I'm a Philly kid, and I got to hug him once in my life, and I will never forget it. But I've been following him because he's actually a brilliant psychologist, and the things that he says, I'm just thinking wow, it took us a century to figure it out, but you figured it out on your own. So one of the things that Will Smith would say is that talent you're born with, but skill you earn from hours and hours of beating on your craft. And if you just take him as an example, I think that he has um, very, very high skill as an actor. But if you imagine that Will Smith at his like level of skill just stopped producing movies, right? Then you can't say that he's still achieving. You could say he's at a high level of skill, but he's not achieving more. He's just like stopped. So what I really admire about Will Smith is that he has improved his skill over years and he continues to become a better actor and challenge himself, but he's still making movies. Like every new movie that he makes, every project that he works on is a new accomplishment. So I think of people who are, most admirable and successful are the ones who are always building on their skill, but they're using their skill. I mean, they're doing things with that developed skill, and those are the things that make a difference in the world, right? They're building companies, they're starting organizations. If a doctor is a great doctor, but they stop treating patients, then their skill might be high, but they're not accomplishing, unless they're applying that skill.
But so I think you buried the lead, though, right? To me, the significant thing is we just did these two formulas, right? Effort shows up twice.
Yes. And so in the way that I talk to my children, I will say to you as well that, when they come home and they tell me that, some kid in their class is, really talented at math and like they don't need to study and, it feels to them like they'll never catch up. I tell them that, talent times effort equals skill. So of course talent counts, but because you need to apply effort again to make that skill turn into an achievement, that effort counts twice.
Yeah. By that definition, it's the biggest determinant in grit.
Well, that, by the way, is a very, a beautiful mathematical equation. Like it appears twice. I think there's some truth to it, but I will say that, that's my idea, and we need to do more research to confirm if that's true. But I do think about just common sense. If you are somebody like Will Smith who is like constantly working, every time you do a movie, he becomes, I assume every time he does a project like a movie or a show, he does get a little better, right? But at the same time, he's accomplished more. Every time you do an interview, you probably learn something, you get like a little bit better, but that's another interview in the can for you. And I feel like that about my own work as a psychologist. Every time I write a paper, I've gotten to be a slightly better psychologist, but the paper itself is an accomplishment. Yeah. So, I do like to think of my effort paying off twice. I got a win on skill and I got a win in terms of actually achieving something.
Okay. So I think that's the building blocks. I think predominantly the audience for this podcast is founders, entrepreneurs, maybe some VCs, whatever. Mm-hmm. What the thing that's good, that's goodness about grit and in the book is that you can learn it, right? It can be increased. This is a kind of a tough question to ask, but is there could you give some grit hacks? Like what are some good, do this to become more gritty, kind of hard and fast rules if there are any?
Do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
Okay, do this. I think reflecting on where you are right now is always the place to start when it comes to behavior change. And I ask that that we do this with self-compassion. There's a lot of beating ourselves up. I used to beat myself up a lot as a young woman. I was very good at feeling guilty and inadequate, which is just its own vicious spiral because then you feel guilty about feeling guilty. It's not that I want people to look in the mirror and criticize themselves in a really, inhumane way. But for example, if you take the grit scale, which is it's on my website, or I put one up like characterlab.org, which is my nonprofit, and it's just like a little pulse check. You can ask some questions to reflect on where you are. I think do that, right? Do self-reflect. And that goes for everything, not just grit, but other very important qualities of character, like your kindness and your empathy, et cetera. So start with self-awareness, do that. Don't over-criticize yourself or don't feel so impatient with yourself. I do think the next thing is to decide on one thing that might help you be a little closer to what you would like to be. So you might reflect and say, I honestly am not doing any deliberate practice in my life at all. And I could work on a lot of things, but I'm just going to work on that. I'm going to develop a daily routine where I have one thing that I'm trying to work on, and getting feedback on it, and then going at the whole thing again and again. That would be a focus that would enable you to have some traction. What I often find is that people will name like 17 things that they want to do differently, and you can't work on 17 things. You can't even work, most of the time they can't work on 2 things. You want to work on 1 thing. When I do a talk, because I often will give talks on things like grit, and I email back the next day because I want to give the organizers a break from their event, and I email back the next day and I say, first of all, with sincerity, I say, thank you for having me. And then I say, is there one thing I can do better next time I give a talk? And I'm very specific because if they tell me like 17 things, I can't handle it, right? My ego can't handle it. I can't work on 7. But if they tell me one thing, the font is too small on your slides, I can fix that one thing. Or if, you're not speaking loudly enough into the microphone, I can work on that. You didn't really look, at the left side of the audience. You stayed on the right side. I can work on that, but I can't work on all those 3 things at once. So, the list goes on, but I would say start with some kind of self-reflection, and then identify one thing that you would enjoy working on, that you think will get you closer to your goal.
That's a great answer. In the interest of time, normally we do this 3 questions, but I think today we will not. That usually signifies the end. I think instead I'm just going to conclude by saying, Dr. Duckworth, thank you so much. It's been a real privilege talking to you about this. It's just such an interesting, I hate the word interesting. It's such a novel topic that there's so much to be thought about. And to be able to talk to you about it today has been great.
I love this quote. There's an investor named Sir John Templeton. He always said, how little we know, how eager to learn. And that is exactly how I feel about grit and character.
This has been Intangibles. As always, I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, our sound engineer. If you would like to work with him, he can be reached via Twitter. His handle is @venture_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve Berg.